encounter with the plasma confinement chamber. It was just a big lucite box, about maybe the size of half of a tennis court on its medial axis. And it was at the direction of Sterling Colgate. I reviewed Colgate briefly before this. My dad took me over to the time lab in East Hanover and asked me, he told me that they wanted to kind of give me a treat or a reward because I had done everything they had asked me to do ably and well, and to the best of my ability. And my dad asked, with Sterling Colgate standing behind him, said, "So Andy, do you want to go to Gettysburg on the day Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address and see him give the address?" And all I could think of was that 1863 photograph of Lincoln by Alexander Gardner, where he's sort of standing forward. He sort of looks like a highly intelligent monkey in a black suit with a black bow tie. And I said, "No, Dad, I don't." I was actually, kind of like panicking because I really didn't want to stand at Abraham Lincoln's feet, thank you very much, when he gave the Gettysburg Address. That would be a little bit too much of a head rush. Previously, I had met Washington and briefed him, but every time the idea of something special in the program came up, I got these waves of panic. And so I said, "No, Dad, I'd rather not go and stand at Abraham Lincoln's feet while he gives the most famous address in the history of the country, thank you." And then Dr. Sterling Colgate says to my dad, "Well, Ray, let's reconvene in a couple of weeks and ask Andy that question again. I bet you dollars to donuts that he'll agree." And so we leave, we come back, I have all this trepidation of several weeks about, I'm going to be going back to the time lab in East Hanover. And by the way, I found that building in my recent trip to East Hanover, New Jersey. And I also walked the streets of Gettysburg and retraced my steps. And so I said, "Yeah, Dad, I'll go." And I was really saying so just to please my dad. So he says, "Excellent, son, so let me show you where you're going." And he took out a map of Gettysburg in 1863, or a little bit later. And he said, "There's a main south street through Gettysburg, I have several, called Washington Street. And we know there's a street to the northwest called Mummasburg Road, because it's still there. And what we're going to do is we're going to put you down here," and he put a little X over on the southern side of Mummasburg Road. "And we want you to start walking. And the first person you encounter, yell, 'Hey friend, which way Gettysburg?'" Apparently people of rural Pennsylvania used, the Quaker terminology of friend for a stranger, when addressing strangers. And so he then described how he was going to walk down Washington Street. He said, "Well, what does Mummasburg remind you of?" And I said, "Mama?" He goes, "Yeah, Mama." So if Mama, if you have to ask somebody, is this Mummasburg Road? That's a good device to remember that. And then who was this street named after here, going straight south through the town of Gettysburg? And I said, "Well, Washington." He said, "Well, who was he?" The father of our country, the first president, whatever. And he said, "Yeah, you're going to be walking through farmland, and then call out to whoever you see to get directions of whether you're walking in the right direction or not. If you are, just continue on that road and then go right the first chance you have and walk straight south. You'll walk straight south into Gettysburg. And there'll be more farmland, but then you'll see 3 blocks of urban streetscape that looks very much like contemporary Morristown, New Jersey, so you'll be familiar with what you're looking at. Then when you walk through those 3 blocks of settled townscape, the first left you can make is going to be a sharp left to the northeast on the northern end of Emmitsburg Road. Gettysburg it's a crossroads town, so that all the roads out of town are named for the town that they point to. Carlisle, Baltimore, Gettysburg, Emmitsburg. They're all town names that are in the streets. So this is the northern pike here of Emmitsburg Road between Washington and Baltimore streets. And there are shops there. So just when you get that far, that close to the cemetery where Lincoln's going to be giving the Gettysburg Address, make that left and just ask somebody there if they can go. You can go with them to the address. So if you're ready to go, son, Valerie can outfit you. We're going to dress you as a Union bugle boy. So I go into this dressing room with about 200 period clothes in it. So they must have been using plasma confinement to send people to all manner of places. And Valerie said, "I want to just have you blend into the social environment, so I'm going to dress you as a Union bugle boy." So she outfitted me with a hat, this really neat dark blue jersey, and pantaloon pants, and these new black shiny shoes as a bugle boy. And then I came out and kind of went ta-da like that to my dad, because it's like buying a new suit at Robert Hall's or something, right? And So he then explained how the plasma confinement chamber works, which is that they would emit plasma under confinement in one side of that lucite chamber, and when I walk past the line on the floor, like a tennis court line, into that plasma, that radioactive plasma, I would sense the floor dropping out below me, and I would wormhole for about 30 seconds, and then would put me down there on the southern side of the sort of the northwest corner of the overall town of Gettysburg, and then I would walk into town. Well, I've retraced those steps during my recent trip to Gettysburg a couple weeks ago, and one thing I found is, I found that two of the buildings, one of the buildings dated from 1776, on the commercial district there on Emmitsburg Road, where John Lawrence Burns ended up giving me shoes and a jacket. The shoes that are visible in this image right here, these grossly oversized men's street shoes and this Union winter parka, were given to me by a downtown Gettysburg cobbler when I went. But recently when I went there, I walked the area where the shops were, where John Burns used a key to go into a men's clothing store and give me the jacket and shoes. And I asked three of the proprietors that are working there now, that they have shops there now, was your shop here when Lincoln was here on November 19th of 1863? And they said, all three of them said yes. I also did some research and found that the Dobbin House, right near the turn from Washington Street onto Emmitsburg, was built sometime between 1776 and 1849, and that the O'Rourke Tavern across the street was built in 1829. So I had 5 commercial establishments of record there. But then when I went to the Adams County Historical Society and the Gettysburg Historical Society, they're relying on a map from 1872 that doesn't show any commercial establishments on that street. And all of the official historians and experts denied that that street had any shops the day I was there. But I said, no, in fact, the day Lincoln was there, there were shops all the way up that northern side of the street. So I went back, in other words, in real time, recently, and proved what was there when I was there in 1863, the day Lincoln was there, and details of Gettysburg that are not in the official history, because the official historians don't believe there were any shops there because their sources don't show those shops. Okay, so Mr. Burns helped me. Actually, I've now got the orientation of where everything was. My father had said Lincoln's going to be arriving on the dais here when he arrives from the Wills Hotel with David Wills. I had thought, therefore, that the Wills Hotel was in this direction, which would be basically west. This is a northern view with Lincoln giving the Gettysburg Address on the front of a northern-looking dais, with him looking true north on the northern perimeter of the Evergreen Cemetery, with this being the later grounds of the military cemetery. And that big U.S. military cemetery in Gettysburg is about a mile south of Evergreen Cemetery. So Lincoln, over my right shoulder here, gave the Gettysburg Address in their traditional civilian cemetery. And I followed John Lawrence Burns down Emmitsburg towards Evergreen's Cemetery, and then onto the grounds on another diagonal, and then down this way, and then we entered through like a gate on this side. There's like an archway there that's still there. And it's in the other picture of Lincoln at Gettysburg, which is the John Richter photograph. This is the so-called Josephine Cobb image of Lincoln at Gettysburg. It was probably taken by Matthew Brady, but Lincoln was found in it by Josephine Cobb when the photograph was donated to the Library of Congress in 1951. And here we find it in the Life magazine archives. So we came in through the gate. There were some trees. There were 2 ladies in their Sunday best who were noticing me, and it looked obviously like a carpetbagger with both military and civilian clothing on. I then came around to the front of the dais and encountered my father dressed as a Pennsylvania farmer, but looking several years at least younger than he did back at the time lab in East Hanover. And so I turned to him and said, Dad, what are you doing here? I didn't know you were going to be here when I got here. And he just remained silent. I said, Dad, it's your son. You're not, and we're in 1863 from 1972, and you're not going to even address me? My dad stepped away, and as is consistent with his training to preserve the operational security of what we're doing, he stepped away and said, I'm not your paw boy, like in a rural Pennsylvania accent. Of course, he was from Summit Hill, so he knew how to fake that, right? Like Pennsylvania farmers dressed in bib overalls. So my dad maintained operational security and didn't address me, and that really spooked me. Then I walked, because of that, I walked around him over to the left side of the dais again, where I was questioned intently by 2 Union officers about what my regiment was, where it was bivouacked, and I didn't have answers to those questions. And then one of the officers leaned towards me while I was chomping on an apple with his paring knife and said, "Boy, are you a little bit touched in the head, son? Have you seen a little bit too much of the fight?" And I said, "Yes, sir," because I knew that he would stop questioning me and I wouldn't be jailed. Now, I then intentionally walked from where Lincoln would soon be speaking, or at least we thought he would be speaking. In fact, he wouldn't speak for 3 hours, so they had actually sent me to Gettysburg too early in the morning, because it was at this location, very shortly after Lincoln, the cheer had gone up, and I realized that Lincoln had stepped on top of the dais. He actually took a horseback ride from the Wills Hotel out here to the north, and come down Baltimore Street, and then down Emmitsburg, and as my dad had said, he arrived on the dais here, but he dismounted his horse there. He'd come down in a procession with 9 other riders and like 100 distinguished citizens. So we don't, here we are in 2013. How many Americans know that Lincoln took a horse to the Gettysburg Address, right? They also don't know that in what was often identified, or until recently identified, as the sole surviving photograph of Lincoln at Gettysburg, there was a 10-and-a-half-year-old me standing prominently in this particular photograph, because I walked over from the dais, put my back to the dais, and then looked in the opposite direction from where my father told me that Lincoln would soon be arriving with David Wills. And I looked to my left, and I saw a man who must have been Matthew Brady setting up his camera on a small stepladder over here. And then he looked over at me and went back under his photographer's canopy. And then I saw a flash as my whole body was experiencing sort of this Kundalini sensation, as my father had described. He said, when the effect wears off, you won't wormhole back like you'll wormhole there. You'll just feel sort of like this super excitation, and you'll suddenly be back in the plasma confinement chamber here in East Hanover. So that's what happened. I mean, right as I was starting to feel like I was going back to the future, which is a term that they may have literally borrowed from me for the feature film, I'm not sure. I saw Brady going back under his canopy, and I sensed the picture was taken. Okay, now, here's one of the 3 quantum synchronicities of this photograph, besides it being not only, which until recently was the sole surviving photograph of Lincoln at Gettysburg, but is literally the first photograph to dispositively show a time traveler from the future, namely myself. There are 3 quantum synchronicities about this photograph that are actually truly bizarre. Actually 4, but let me go through those. One is that you can see I'm holding a cylinder here. What it was a scrolled up piece of paper that had a letter to Gideon Welles, who was the Secretary of the Navy for Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, to explaining who I was and to offer me aid and assistance in the event I needed it when I was in the field, whether I was injured and whether I was distressed or detained in the field. I should be taken to Secretary Welles to be given his aid and assistance. Well, because I faded back from view while I was still holding that, and hence didn't have to be protected by Gideon Welles in any way, I actually faded and went back to the future. I didn't use that instructions to Navy Secretary Gideon Welles. But in 2011, when I was in distress in the field on the island of Maui, somebody who had friended me on Facebook 2 days before I asked her assistance, my friend Janet Lesson, helped me and gave me aid and assistance in 2011 on the island of Maui, and she is a direct lineal descendant of Navy Secretary Gideon Welles. That's the first quantum synchronicity. The second quantum synchronicity that's as bizarre, so here I finally get the help from the Welles family, but it's in 2011, not in 1863. The second bizarre coincidence is that the photo analyst at the Library of Congress, Josephine Cobb, who found Lincoln in this Matthew Brady photograph on the dais as he was sitting down, I believe, is the great aunt of William Brett Stillings, who you'll be introduced to tomorrow, who was one of my fellow Mars jumpers. I mean, his mother's name is Gail Cobb Stillings. Mr. Stillings married a Cobb. So Brett is literally related. He's the great nephew of the woman at the Library of Congress who found Lincoln in this doubly famous photograph because now that everybody's known that Lincoln's in this, they're now learning that I'm in it from 1972. The third synchronicity is that my best friend from college, Chris Baker, is a cousin of the Gettysburg family that sold their farm to the Eisenhowers when President Eisenhower and Mamie Eisenhower retired in Gettysburg after he left the presidency. And I'm personal friends with their great-granddaughter, Laura Magdalene Eisenhower. When I went back to Gettysburg recently, I realized something extraordinary, which was that not only was Gettysburg celebrating the sesquicentennial of the battle there and of the Gettysburg Address there, but I was celebrating my sesquicentennial having gone there in 1972. What is that? 40 years in my past, but ultimately 150 years, because in 1972, from the present date of 2013, during the sesquicentennial, I went back to a town in America 150 years after I had been there. So I think that's the longest time that somebody's gone to a place via time travel and then gone back there in real time. But I went back in real time 150 years after the original visit. So now there are some recent findings about the Cobb image of Lincoln at Gettysburg. People have asked, well, in the plasma confinement process, did you take the oversized shoes and the jacket back and the cap and the letter to Gideon Wells? And the answer is yes, there was a plasma effect around me. So this stuff came back. Now, with a plasma effect being around a time traveler from the future, isn't it curious that there's this gray ET standing here with his arms out, like touching me? Here's his head, his shoulders, and his two arms are like literally pointing to me. Definitely a nonlinear aspect of this photograph that's in the original photograph. Trying to think, the other thing that's been found recently is blow-ups of my face show through my cheek my whole left teeth, both top and bottom of my left teeth. Now that's something that we can achieve via X-ray. You could put an X-ray unit up against somebody's cheek and show their whole dentition on the left side of their head, right? The problem is that the discoverer of radium, Marie Curie, would not be born until 1867, okay? We didn't have X-ray back then. There's no way that Matthew Brady, setting up, a Hasselblad camera of that era, could have created some kind of radiation effect or X-ray effect where my teeth would be visible through my left cheek. So the image of me itself shows what we've now found, it shows what I reported, which is that it was as I was fading from view that the man, namely Matthew Brady, took the photograph. So I think we're going to discover more in this photograph. But everybody's commented how, first of all, how well-fed I look. I had a chubby face then, as I do now. And look at how skinny, for example, this adult male is. This is obviously one of the citizens of Gettysburg. Their crops had been destroyed back in July of 1863 when the Battle of Gettysburg swept through and passed their town. Look at how skinny this guy was as a result of privation of food during the war. But I look pretty well fed. I look like a kid from New Jersey from 1972. And also the casual way I'm standing is sort of like that, that kind of that 1970s kind of casual thing. Somebody would be standing in their wallabies, So this is, in fact, me, and I will go to my last day sticking to that position because that's what happened. I ended up getting photographed, but I didn't see Lincoln. I later asked my dad back at the house. I mean, I heard him, the cry that went up, but I didn't see him give any part of the address. And in fact, I faded from view before I could have seen him even start several hours later. Back then, in 1972, I asked my dad what it was like to see the Gettysburg Address. And he said it was just a man with a beard standing there on the stage giving a speech. And I said, well, don't you remember anything special about it? He said, in fact, I do. He said that Lincoln's voice was very, very rural and high-pitched. And I said, well, what did it sound like, Dad? And he said it sounded like this. He said, Lincoln sounded like, he was speaking like this. 77 years ago, our forefathers brought forth to this continent a new nation. So it was like my dad said it was very rural. And of course, Lincoln was a rustic born in Hodgenville, Kentucky, right? And had practiced law almost his whole career in Illinois on the prairie, the edge of American civilization in the Midwest at that time. And we now know, and this is literally a discovery made after my dad had imitated Lincoln's voice, that Lincoln had a disease of the connective tissue, which affects sometimes the vocal cords, called Marfan syndrome. And we've had, in fact, there were several professional athletes who died of it because it also affects the performance of the heart. And so how was it that my dad, just looking at Lincoln, if this was not a true story, would have been able to say that his vocalization was very stretched out, very high-pitched as a result of having some kind of something affecting his vocal cords. In fact, we now know it was Marfan syndrome. And that's really all that he could say. He said, you know, he wasn't particularly frightening to watch. I mean, I knew it was Lincoln, but he was just a man with a beard. And then I said, Dad, can you send me back so I can see Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address? And he said, no. And I said, why not? And he said, if we send you back, there'll be 2 of you there, and that'll be a threat to operational security. So again, that's the duplication factor when you have multiple returns to the same, or forward displacements to the same place in time-space. So how was it that I looked older and to my dad, and my dad looked younger to me? Well, that's easy. We had been sent at different times to the same day. So he had gone, let's say, in 1967, 68, when we first started teleporting. And he said, you know, when I saw you there over on my right, you were addressing me as your dad, that's how I learned you would be in the program. So the Andy that he knew that morning, when he was sent originally, I was like a 4-year-old back at the house, and here he's seeing, or 6-year-old or something, and here he is seeing me at 10 and a half, but on the same day that he was sent there. So to me, he looked like he did in the mid-60s with his crew cut rather than his straight haircut. So that can also be something that can be used for intelligence gathering, where you have 2 people from different times literally meet each other on a common day in time-space, and that's what happened to my dad and I. There was a displacement in our relative ages in both directions, because he had jumped earlier, and then I jumped, but I jumped to the same day he was there. Okay, the jump room was just in development, the one that we would take to Mars by 1976, according to Michael C. Relf, one of my fellow jumpers, was just about emerging. Ultimately, it was emerging on Project Pegasus when I was a kid. They had like small jump rooms that they were jumping documents from Washington, D.C. to the atomic labs in New Mexico, because obviously it was instantaneous, and we didn't have fax machines. But ultimately, I would be jumping from a jump room that was a dual use of the elevator inside this Hughes aircraft building in El Segundo, California. And that's just kind of a description of the fact that the elevator inside would morph from a box into a cylinder. We have to right ourselves with our hand as if we're walking through a water main between Earth and Mars. So I have to throw that in there as the 8th form of time travel that I would encounter, but 10 years later, not when I was serving in Project Pegasus. Okay, why use children? Part 3. First, we were experimentees. They thought they might introduce Tesla teleportation to move the president, the vice president, and their families, and so forth, other executive branch officials, ambassadors. Backgrounds, not children who had experienced privation, as the kids from Latin America had, because they wanted to test the physical and mental effects of Tesla teleportation on children who are around the age that children tend to be when their dad's president. You know, look at the Obama girls. They were about, when he came into office in 2008, I think the younger girl was about the age I was when I first teleported. And who knows, maybe they've been teleported already. But they wanted to have us jump to New Mexico, and then we took part in a battery of SAT-type mental tests and were medically examined for heartbeat, blood pressure, and so forth, heart rhythms, any presence of heart arrhythmias, and so forth, at an old school site in Lamy, New Mexico. So we were experimentees. I don't like to use the term guinea pigs, because we were actively not just time traveling, but gathering intelligence for the U.S. government. So we were not guinea pigs. We were just giving them a baseline understanding of what would happen. We were also necessities, because they found when they were working with adults in the chronovisors, when the chronovisors became holographic arrays, that the size, the heartbeat, the respiration, a sneeze or a cough, the footfall of an adult would cause the hologram to go on the blink, or fritz, as an early television set would. Basically, the hologram would start quaking like gelatin and then just pop out, even if, let's say, an adult asked the technician something. So they could either use diminutive people with different growth disorders, or they could train a cadre of gifted and talented American school children, such as myself, and they decided to do the latter because they decided to convert us into VUEs, namely kids whose perceptions would be so keen that we would be, because we were tabula rasa, as they explained, we would be able to give them more accurate intelligence when we were time traveling, And they also decided to use gifted and talented kids because we were trainees. We were time-space cadets who, as Rumsfeld had explained back in the bar in Albuquerque, would be run through the Naval Academy after high school and involved as a pretext for involving us in future time travel activities. Okay, part 4, the findings. I'll go through these rather quickly. They knew about Nixon's resignation. In 1973, when I was in Albuquerque, in New Mexico, having jumped there from the fall of 1971 with my father, I walked behind 2 guys who'd been identified as CIA guys, and one of them said to the other, "So it looks like what happens is that Nixon gets ensnared in a scandal called Watergate and resigns the presidency." And the other guy just slid onto the bar and just went, "Oh, Christ," and collapsed. Because these were Nixon Republicans in the project, and there were a lot of Nixon Republicans in the CIA. What I learned from Bernard Mendez, my fellow jumper, who was for years essentially the Indiana Jones of the U.S. time-space program, he has saved hundreds of people in trouble in the field, both in time-space and just in space, just in the jungles of Costa Rica and on Mars. Bernie claims that Richard Nixon was set up to leave the office under Watergate because people had been exploiting the time travel technology to create billion-dollar fortunes. And when Nixon learned of that, he tried to prevent it. And the Watergate scandal was propagated underneath him to pull the rug out from underneath him. So when you talk about Nixon here being the president when Project Pegasus was launched, he may have lost his presidency in 1974 by trying to police the very time travel activities that his administration had initiated. Kind of ironic, to say the least. I also know that they knew about AIDS, not necessarily in terms of the name of it, but in terms of the notion of an epidemic disease that at least partially could be a venereal disease in its transmission, because they were watching the personal conduct of people, and what they actually thought they had found is a rise in autoerotic sexual activity as distinguished from companion sexual activity. And Connie Chavez was looking at the same scene, and she said, "Well, didn't they say there's some disease that emerges where you can have sex and you can die?" So she had remembered another previous talk about AIDS. So they knew about AIDS, at least the phenomenon, if not the HIV/AIDS, terminology. Another thing that my dad revealed before his death in '90, I was asking him for more things they knew about the future. Oh, okay, the advent of the internet. Was that the...
That was the next one.
Okay, yeah, okay. I know they knew about the advent of the internet because one day at the La Hacienda restaurant in Old Town Albuquerque, John Alexander McCone, who everybody was calling Alec, was trying to explain to my dad what the internet was. So they're sitting across from each other, and I'm kind of wandering around like kids do, around the picnic table in that restaurant, and or a long table in that restaurant. And John McCone looks over at my father and says, "Ray, what the internet is a global system of communication. It's really the fulfillment of Vannevar Bush's primary fundamental. I mean, we see people consulting it every morning. It's the primary device in their house or at work. And what it is, it's this global communication system where a person sits in front of us, a VDT, obviously they're engineering types, so they have to call a television screen a VDT, right? A video display terminal. And they're sitting and typing on a keyboard that's very much like the ones that are emerging now in our electronic typewriters. And through that system, they can communicate in TypeScript with anybody else on the planet who's on this system of global communication." And my dad said, "Well, what about these suffixes?" He goes, "What do you mean, Ray?" My dad goes, "Well, what about .com, .edu, .info?" And McCone said, "Those are just destinations on the global communication system, Ray. .com means communications. .edu is clearly an academic institution that they're communicating with." My dad stands up and pulls his leg over the bench there at this picnic table like bench in the restaurant and says, I don't know about this .com thing." And John McCone gets kind of vociferous and says, "It's just telling the person on the system that it's a communications type of communication, right?" And my dad turns around and says, "How do we know that? Maybe it means the commies have taken over by then." So that's my favorite anecdote, because it really shows that these time scientists and engineers did not have a full grasp of what the future held. In fact, it became the rise of the dot-commies, not the commies, when the internet ultimately emerged. more towards his, well, not during the project days, but towards his death in 1990, I had a conversation with everything they had learned about the future. And my dad said, well, we definitely found out that there was going to be widespread use of mobile phones. And I said, why? And he said, well, every time we propagated like a street scene, you know, Denver, Colorado, 2005, Chicago, Illinois, 2020, we all saw all you people who are going to go on and survive into those years walking around with these little walkie-talkies. So again, even 20 years after the project, my dad didn't have a full grasp of our present. But that was another thing they couldn't help but see, because cellular phones are so ubiquitous that, you know, he was describing how they would just look at any scene, like a hotel suite, and, you know, a hotel in New York City in 2015, and people were walking all over the street with their cell phones. They also clearly knew about 9/11. My dad was using the La Hacienda restaurant and the sort of unofficial government services of Connie Chavez as a kind of an organizational exchange post for his involvement in Project Pegasus, a collection area, if you will. One day we had just completed lunch there at the La Hacienda restaurant in Old Town Albuquerque. One of the men working there, Wentworth Brown, who I actually connected with and got a photograph of him. Wentworth called over my dad and said, Ray, we've got a telephone call for you. Yeah, at your phone, right, near the door. And we went over there, my dad picked up the phone call, just listened intently, and then thrust the phone down rather briskly and said, come on, son, get in the car, or follow me to the car. So we followed him to his rental car there in New Mexico. And he gets down to Socorro, New Mexico in about an hour, which means it's 90 miles south of Albuquerque. So he must have been driving like at 80, 85, 90 miles per hour. We go into the Aerojet Corporation facility that used to be there. It was a C-shaped building with a zero-scaped front yard. New Mexico Tech was right behind it. And we'd go through the center and we'd be cleared through a security desk there with a man with a badge and a gun. And my dad showed his Department of Defense credentials and said, my son's coming with me. These prison bar-like bars rise up, allowing us access to the left side of the sea. And this technician approaches my dad in the hallway, extremely excited, saying, we've got it, Ray. We've got scenes of the domestic Pearl Harbor. Check this out. So we go down. We go into a room with about 20 monitors, and the two young technicians there, who must have been like graduate physics students under Sterling Colgate at New Mexico Tech, are playing a video, and it was a Betamax video. They put a Betamax tape in, which means that the U.S. government had Beta like 10 years before it was introduced. And what we saw was about a 20-second film loop of one of the planes hitting one of the Twin Towers in Manhattan on the day it happened 30 years in the future, the day it would happen 30 years in the future. After seeing that, my dad was frequently being quizzed at lunch by people who didn't have as high a security clearance, like, what is this 911 thing, Ray, this 9/11? We understand it's some kind of domestic Pearl Harbor. Do you know what really happens that day? And at one of those lunches, my dad said, yeah, we know that Middle Eastern hijackers hijack commercial airliners and slam them into the Twin Towers that are now being built in New York City and the Pentagon. And then one of the guys says, so well, then what happens? He goes, well, sadly, the World Trade Center sustains a fatal hit, a base hit, and they collapse. And one of the guys was just, utterly despondent. He goes, oh, that's horrible, right there in Manhattan, those buildings that high just come falling down? And my dad goes, yep, like a ton of bricks. And then they wait a little while and they say, well, what happens after that, Ray? And he said, the country picks itself up, dusts itself off, and goes on again like nothing happened. Now that was my dad's perspective for some reason. He left out the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. But he was giving the conventional Time magazine version of the event, and why would that be? Because probably we were watching just images. There was no way of knowing who had committed the airplane strike on one of the Twin Towers. But in the microfilm summaries of future events, it would have been the conventional, kind of version of the event that they would disseminate in school books, that they would put in Time magazine end of the year review type articles and so forth. So my dad had the conventional story. That's not to say that I don't believe it might have been an inside job. I'm just saying that the story that was being disseminated by Project Pegasus to itself from the future, in addition to the footage of the event, was the conventional account. And that's the one that my dad would then explain to his colleagues. Another thing, they said, well, what do they build? 5 minutes later, one of the guys, these guys being engineers and architects and so forth, and physicists, say, well, what do they build where the towers come down, Ray, from another table? And he goes, they build like a monument that's a big spire like this, and he actually made the shape of Freedom Tower. So that's the grasp they had of public events in the early 70s, was not just 9/11, but its literal aftermath when they rebuilt that site in downtown Manhattan. They also had, and this is a very important thing, they had a notion or a belief on the program that they shouldn't play God and act in the present to change future events as a result of detecting them, but they did, on the margin in one particular area, was they did identify future presidents, and here's how I know that. I know they had identified President Jimmy Carter as a future U.S. president because Alfred Lambermont Weber's book, Exopolitics, was taken by my father out of a black leather pouch at lunch with Connie Chavez and myself. And I actually heard Connie ask my dad, who is Alfred Lambermont Weber? She also asked, who is Jimmy Carter? Because at the front of that book, Alfred put a passage from Jimmy Carter associated with the sending of that spacecraft out into space with the image of the man and the woman and the chart to find our location in space and all that, our DNA. And my dad said something like he's presently he either said governor or lieutenant governor of Georgia, and he becomes president. So we know that DARPA, the CIA, knew about the Carter presidency about 5 years, at least 5 years before it happened. I know more directly that the presidency of George H.W. Bush was known because I was invited to a lunch, kind of a late lunch, a 4 o'clock lunch or early dinner at the La Hacienda restaurant when both George H.W. Bush and his young son, then in his mid-20s, George W. Bush, were present as guests. And so if you could advance a couple forward to grab it, George W. Bush. The reason that I know I met them is because they were introduced to me. In fact, Barbara Bush, the wife of the first Bush president and the mother of the second, George W. Bush, was also there. And George W. Bush was going to every table where there were project people and announcing what he and his father had just learned. He was saying, have you heard? My daddy and I are going to be president. Sorry, I'm a little bit out of breath. But let me try that again. Where George W. Bush was going around to all the tables saying, hey, have you heard? My daddy and I are going to be president. That was what I was going for there. Anyway, so he and his father clearly had just been apprised of their mutual presidencies, and he was in the shock of it. We know he had a battle with alcoholism after that for a couple of decades. But imagine being 24, 25 years old and being told that you're going to be president. So if we could go back, one. I also know from direct personal experience that the presidents were being told and have been told. Because I met this man, President Bill Clinton, William Jefferson Clinton, who was so young looking that he probably was still at Georgetown as an undergraduate. It was at a table at the La Hacienda. I was sitting here at about age 8. A college-aged Bill Clinton was here. Harold Agnew, the director of the Los Alamos Labs, was here. Ivan Browning, the director of science and technology for CIA, was here. And then my father was sitting here. And his colleague Joseph Conason from Parsons was sitting here. And they were just kind of smiling over at Bill Clinton. And he said, you know, fellas, I know that you work for the atomic research community, and I know that you do remarkable things like designing and building more effective nuclear weapons all the time and everything, but sometimes I get up in the morning and I look at myself in the mirror and I have to pinch myself because I say, me, Bill Clinton, President of the United States someday? I'm telling you, fellas, that dog don't hunt. Okay, that was a little better. But anyway, Clinton knew. He knew, and he knew at a young age, that he was going to be president. I don't know when he was briefed. I mean, he was young, yes, but maybe he was already at Yale Law School. Maybe he was sent down to New York City from New Haven, or into the library of the Yale Law School, and maybe up to a meeting room, and maybe, who knows, maybe, you know, Barbara Barbara Walters and Vernon Walters and Senator Mac Mathias and a couple of other dignitaries were there to kind of let him into the secret. But he clearly knew by the time that we had that lunch in Albuquerque. And he was very young. He was skinny. Who was he? The father of our country, the first president, whatever. And he said, yeah, you're going to be walking through farmland and then call out to whoever you see to get directions of whether you're walking in the right direction or not. If you are, just continue on that road and then go right the first chance you have and walk straight south. You'll walk straight south into Gettysburg. And there'll be more farmland, but then you'll see 3 blocks of urban streetscape that looks very much like contemporary Morristown, New Jersey, so you'll be familiar with what you're looking at. Then when you walk through those 3 blocks of settled townscape, the first left you can make is going to be a sharp left to the northeast on the northern end of Emmitsburg Road. Gettysburg it's a crossroads town, so that all the roads out of town are named for the town that they point to. My encounter with the plasma confinement chamber. It was just a big lucite box, about maybe the size of half of a tennis court on its medial axis. And it was at the direction of Sterling Colgate. I reviewed Colgate briefly before this. My dad took me over to called Washington Street. And we know there's a street to the northwest called Mummisburg Road because it's still there. And what we're going to do is we're going to put you down here, and you put a little X over on the southern side of Mummisburg Road. And we want you to start walking. And the first person you encounter, yell, "Hey friend, which way Gettysburg?" Apparently people of rural Pennsylvania used, the Quaker terminology of friend for a stranger, when addressing strangers. And so he then described how he was going to walk down Washington Street. He said, "Well, what does Mummisburg remind you of?" And I said, "Mama." He goes, "Yeah, Mama." So if Mama, if you have to ask somebody, is this Mummisburg Road? That's a good device to remember that. And then who was this street named after here, going straight south through the town of Gettysburg? And I said, "Well, Washington." And he said, "Well, the program came up. I got these waves of panic." And so I said, "No, Dad. I'd rather not go and stand at Abraham Lincoln's feet while he gives the most famous address in the history of the country. Thank you." And then Dr. Sterling Colgate says to my dad, "Well, Ray, let's reconvene in a couple of weeks and ask Andy that question again. I bet you dollars to donuts that he'll agree." And so we leave, we come back. I have all this trepidation of several weeks about, I'm going to be going back to the time lab in East Hanover. And by the way, I found that building in my recent trip to East Hanover, New Jersey. And I also walked the streets of Gettysburg and retraced my steps. And so I said, "Yeah, Dad, I'll go." And I was really saying so just to please my dad. So he says, "Excellent, son, so let me show you where you're going." And he took out a map of Gettysburg in 1863, or a little bit later. And he said, "There's a main south street through Gettysburg." I've said the time lab in East Hanover, and he told me that they wanted to kind of give me a treat or a reward because I had done everything they had asked me to do ably and well, to the best of my ability. And my dad asked, with Sterling Colgate standing behind him, said, "So Andy, do you want to go to Gettysburg on the day Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address and see him give the address?" And all I could think of was that 1863 photograph of Lincoln by Alexander Gardner, where he's sort of standing forward. He sort of looks like a highly intelligent monkey in a black suit with a black bow tie. And I said, "No, Dad, I don't." I was actually, kind of like panicking because I really didn't want to stand at Abraham Lincoln's feet, thank you very much, when he gave the Gettysburg Address. That would be a little bit too much of a head rush. Previously, I had met Washington and briefed him, but every time the idea of something special